Hi, here I am again in Washington, D.C., and I'm doing an interview with Zaid Jilani. Zaid's a reporter with Intercept, and I'm in their offices in Washington, D.C. How are you, Zaid?
I'm great.
You've seen a lot of Zaid recently on Democracy Now! Talking about the elections. He's covered a lot of different things, and we're going to make sure that this is a conversation about foreign policy. And a few years ago, something happened to Zed while he was at a think tank writing for Think Progress, in which he was let go for some remarks that he was writing about. Could you give us the background on that, please, Zed?
Yeah, I think that there were a number of us at Center for American Progress, which was this think tank that's very close to the Democratic Party. It was founded by John Podesta, who runs Hillary's campaign today, and it was mostly alumni from the Clinton White House administration, but also some from the Obama administration. And basically what was happening is we had a number of us who were there writing, fairly, I think, a little bit more balanced about Israeli-Palestinian politics than what you normally see. We didn't just want to blame the Palestinians for everything. We wanted to, offer what I thought was fairly measured criticism of Israeli policy as well, and sort of Israeli policy that's not helpful to resolving the conflict there. And I think that in the course of doing that, we had a number of people come to Center for American Progress and complain. Those included officials at, AIPAC, which is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, as well as, former AIPAC staffers, Josh Block in particular, and a number of people allied with that sort of thinking, complaining to our think tank that, our writing, they viewed it as unbalanced, which is, ironic because I think we were one of the more balanced outlets because we were willing to talk both sides of this equation. And I think as a result of that pressure, a number of us just didn't feel like it was necessarily a comfortable environment for that type of writing. And so, I took another job within, a few months of all that starting. And a number of, I think pretty much everyone else who was there writing on this topic ended up doing the same at one point or another. So, I think that was illustrative of sort of the way that the discourse on this issue is sort of kept in bounds by certain pressure groups and interest groups and people who just don't want to have an honest discussion about the topic that that's badly needed.
So you were called an anti-Semitic for some of the remarks, and in looking back at the remarks, they certainly didn't seem too caustic to me. Fast forward now, and we're seeing with things like the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, legislation and language being used that anyone who is trying to boycott Israel is anti-Semitic. So if you're new to this area, what's changing? It seems like it's getting a clampdown kind of time where you're not allowed to say anything negative. You can't boycott. President Carter, Nelson Mandela both called Israel an apartheid state. Can you kind of give us some insight into how to understand the confusion? So someone, when they are talking about Israel and have friends who are Jewish, are not trying to look like they hate Israel or they hate Jewish people. They're just merely discussing what they're seeing happening in the political landscape.
Well, I think something that's very important to remember is that when you are advocating for the change of a policy that a government is implementing, it's not necessarily anything personal towards the country or its people or towards any faith group or any racial or ethnic group. And I think that goes across the board. There are many people in the United States who protested the war in Iraq who were called anti-American because, supposedly they were against the whole country or they were against the troops or the soldiers because they disagree with the policy of the war. And I think the same thing applies with respect to Israel. Are there people who are anti-Semitic in this world? Obviously, there are people who are anti-Semitic in this world. But there are, I think the vast majority of people out there are just looking at Israeli policy and saying, hey, this is not a policy that's respecting human rights. It's not a policy that would lead to a resolution of conflict. And it's not a policy that, in the end of the day, even benefits Israel in the long run. In the long run, I don't think Israel it benefits very much from being a garrison state, from being a state that can't respect the rights of its neighbors, the Palestinians, or the internal Arab-Israeli population. And I don't think that it's in their own long-term interest to continue these sorts of policies. So, I think that people are very quick to make insinuations and accusations whenever you're offering any criticism on this topic. But I think, in the long run, again, I think people who are trying to call Israel to defend values of human rights instead of attacking human rights. I think those people are, they're pro-Palestinian and they're pro-Israeli, because I think that the country would be a lot better off if it were to respect the human rights of people there, and if it were to improve its sort of really terrible human rights situation that it has today.
So you're one of the really funny people to watch on Twitter. You have a very serious, dry sense of humor in your posts. I want people to understand how you think in terms of foreign policy, because that seems to be the thing that I'm most attracted to what you're putting out there. What's your framework that you're using when you're looking at a foreign policy issue?
I mean, I think in terms of foreign policy, we often have very constricted debates. Say, hey, this is the U.S. interest to do this or that, or we look at it in a very short-term way, saying, hey, ISIS exists, it's very bad, we need to do everything we can to crush it. Make all sorts of alliances we can to crush it, and use all sorts of warfare and violence. But I think the way we look at foreign policy should be much more holistic. We should look at the root causes of a lot of our problems. We should look at the fact that, hey, there may not just be one type of U.S. interest. There may be many different types of U.S. interests. It may not just be a U.S. interest to have stable allies who we can give weapons and money to, but also to have allies who respect human rights, who have allies who would respect democracy and respect fair elections and respect freedoms. And I think that a lot of that gets pushed aside, especially when people are scared. I think when people are scared, they see an enemy. It's all over the news. The threat from that enemy is greatly exaggerated, and people feel they feel scared and insecure, and understandably so, particularly the way the news media covers these topics. And I think they want an immediate solution, and often that immediate solution can create a lot of problems in the future. For example, we have ISIS today. ISIS would probably not have existed if we had just never invaded Iraq. But I don't think people thought 2, 3, 4 steps out when they were saying, hey, we should invade Iraq, or when people were scared and feeling that we had to do something. So I think my foreign policy framework and my approach is that we have to have a holistic approach that looks at all the ramifications of our actions, and that also understands that, just as our domestic policy should be guided by our values, I think the foreign policy should be guided by our values as well. And having a foreign policy that often is just knee-jerk in its reaction, and which disregards our values, disregards our freedoms with respect to surveillance, disregards our respect for human rights with respect to some of the alliances we make, and disrespects our desire to eventually have peace with the fact that we've had, 16 years of warfare today. And I think that if we do take that more holistic approach, if we do slow down and really understand everything that's at play, we can have a much more, I think, intelligent and humane and effective foreign policy.
Well, Donald Trump has been getting hammered for who he's choosing as his foreign policy advisors, but no one seems to be asking Hillary Clinton who her foreign policy advisors are. What would you say is what do you see as her foreign policy, and who do you think might be her foreign policy advisors? And how is money influencing perhaps her foreign policy decisions?
Well, it was really interesting. Earlier in the race against Bernie Sanders earlier this year, she had about a dozen of either her former staff or former Clinton administration staff, foreign policy staff, write a letter saying, hey, Bernie Sanders' foreign policy is really dangerous, it would undermine American interests, so on and so forth. It's really interesting. Over half of the people on that letter were either defense contractors who had very strong links to defense contractors, meaning they worked for like a firm or a nonprofit that works with contractors. And, I think that's part of what we call the deep state. And the deep state is people who worked in government, who go to industry, who cash out, might go back into government, as we're seeing with Clinton today. And I think she's deeply embedded in that deep state. I think that a lot of the conventional forms of foreign policy thinking over the past, post 9/11 years are encapsulated in the folks that she surrounds herself with, and the folks that are possibly going to get administration positions and are advising her today. I mean, she has, technically over 1,000 policy advisors, meaning people that she's tapped on the shoulder and said, hey, you're part of our team. We'll occasionally go to you for advice. We may be talking points, so on and so forth. And most of those people, you'll find them in elite think tanks in Washington, D.C. You'll find them at the defense contractors. You'll find them in foundations and nonprofits who are fairly close to consensus views on foreign policy. I mean, she isn't bringing anyone in who's very unorthodox, who's saying, hey, we need to rethink some of these alliances, who's saying, hey, we need to drastically reduce the military budget, and, we need a different approach towards, human rights and things like that. I think she's very, very conventional to where the Democratic Party has been over the last 13, 14, 15 years. And if anything, she seems to be more in favor of a more militaristic policy than Barack Obama. I mean, if you'll notice, Barack Obama, who I think has been far from pacifist, he's also a fairly hawkish president. His administration went to the recent APAC conference, and Biden was booed for his comments on settlements. Clinton did not get any boos at APAC, right? She got very strong applauses. She had equated boycotting Israel to anti-Semitism, which is, while the Obama administration opposes these boycotts, they're often a little bit less quick to draw that connection. And I think, if anything, she's trying to bring the policy towards a more militaristic direction, a less human rights focused, a less peace-oriented direction. And I think that that should worry Democrats who feel like the last two presidents where the policy has oriented us in a very militaristic way, in a very hawkish way, in a way that's ballooned defense budgets, ballooned surveillance, ballooned curtails of human rights and civil liberties. And I think that she wants to continue that. She has not shown a whole lot of tendency to try to rein that back in. And I think that's something that's very dangerous that Democrats aren't necessarily looking at.
The dark state and the dark money, how is it playing out when, I guess, I see that Hillary's Assistant Secretary of State to European Affairs was Victoria Nuland, who's married to Robert Kagan, very, very conservative neocon. How does that not get played out somehow, where you've got a guy in a think tank who's getting a lot of money to be there and help craft policy, whose wife is working for the Secretary of State? How is Victoria's foreign policy maybe giving us insight into what we'll see Hillary's?
Yeah, well, I think there's actually another dynamic here that's coming into play, which is that, the other side, it seems fairly likely that Donald Trump would be the GOP nominee. I mean, anything can happen, obviously, but it seems fairly likely that he'll be on that side. And I think a lot of neoconservatives don't really trust him because he's sort of all over the place. He kind of does his own thing. He isn't necessarily bringing a whole lot of them onto the table. So I think that actually there was a Bush administration official who, I think just last week or earlier this week, had said that, hey, maybe we should consider Hillary. So there's actually a real chance that Hillary realigns the alliances within the Democratic and Republican Party to where the neoconservatives decide, hey, it's a safer gamble to go with Hillary. Hillary Clinton has always had an open ear to a lot of our ideas. She supported the war in Iraq. She supported the Patriot Act. She's generally been friendly to NSA surveillance and NSA spying. So, why wouldn't a lot of them want to side with her? I mean, I think their biggest concern is that the more dovish wing of Democrats would constrain her somewhat. But, traditionally, as we've seen, I think, under the last two presidents, the president has a fairly free hand on foreign policy. And in terms of the foreign policy activities of their administration, including trade, by the way, which is another area where a number of her former staff and advisors have cashed out and decided to, promote trade deals and things, which I think should raise some eyebrows among some people who actually believe that she would oppose Trans-Pacific Partnership. But I mean, the point is that she's very deeply embedded, as you just mentioned, with people who are basically supporting the foreign policy status quo or want a more militaristic foreign policy status quo, who want more surveillance, who want more crackdowns on liberties and on encryption, which is a huge issue right now. And I think, that Hillary has a real chance of orienting the party. If Obama was straddling the fence between a Bush and what came before, Clinton might be pushing it more back towards Bush. I think that's something that should concern a lot of people. And I think the fact that you do have neoconservatives such as Max Boot, who basically said that he would vote for Hillary over Donald Trump, should concern people. I mean, there is a reason that they're actually favoring a lot of what she is doing and saying, because she has generally favored their initiatives, even if she's not all the way there. I mean, she did, for example, she does support the deal with Iran, which most of them oppose. But the question is, how strong would she hold on that? Given her tendencies to generally side with sort of the more with the hawks and with the military and the surveillance community.
This is just deja vu all over again. You've just mapped out how our foreign policy with our next president, probably Hillary Clinton, or the people who are now coming out to advise Trump, is just going to be more about war. And the us against them, the fear factor. In the next month, when the dust settles and we get it down to two candidates, the chances are foreign policy is going to be discussed most of the time in order to drive people to choose through their fears one choice over the other. This could play out also domestically with more surveillance, etc. How do you think this could, any signs there, signals there in Hillary's policies towards surveillance, her attitudes towards Edward Snowden? What do you think?
Well, it was really interesting. Following the attacks in Belgium, she immediately pivoted to saying that we need tougher surveillance, that we need to look at encryption, which has been a particularly thorny issue following the case in San Bernardino, where the FBI is basically looking for more or less looking for a backdoor into iPhones, which would, of course, not only enable them to look into the iPhone of the attackers in San Bernardino, but would enable them to look into your iPhone or anyone's iPhone, because then they'd have the technology and the know-how to do it. And I think that Clinton has, in this primary environment, facing a stronger challenge from Bernie Sanders than probably many pundits expected, she's been a little bit more leery to sort of talk about her viewpoint on that, because I think a lot of Democratic voters are very wary of warfare, are very wary of surveillance and government intrusion into our lives. And I think that with the next month, I think we're already seeing a little bit of a preview of what Clinton would utilize against, for example, President Donald Trump. I mean, she recently said that something to the extent that, Trump would be like a gift to the Kremlin, which is a very strange thing for a Democrat to say, as, usually it's the other way around. Usually Republicans are the ones, red baiting the Democrats, saying, hey, you're totally with the Russians, or before that the Soviets, or, you're too soft on them, that sort of thing. And I think that Clinton is sort of previewing that she will try to pivot to Trump's right, to say that he's not tough enough, to say that he's not strong enough, to say that he's too anti-NATO. He has some skepticism about NATO. He's too anti-militarism, which is a very odd place to be, because I certainly don't think that Republican primary voters would think that Trump isn't militaristic or violent enough or authoritarian enough. But Clinton seems to be trying to get to his right. So I think we very well could see a realignment within the parties. I mean, it sort of depends on Trump, as Trump is a very sort of he's a very sort of tempered figure, and that sort of says one thing one day and another thing the other day. So we don't really know where things are going to shake down with him. But it's very it's entirely possible that Clinton would realign people who want to see a more militaristic foreign policy, who want to see more foreign adventurism with the military, who want to see a greater defense budget, who want to see more surveillance, and they want to see tougher policing. Those people would go to Hillary Clinton, because it seems as if Trump may very well, he may very well think it's not a good deal. He's a businessman. He may think spending, billions and billions of dollars, policing Europe with the NATO alliance, or with large troop presences in South Korea or in Japan, he may just think that's a waste of money. He may just not want to do it from a business standpoint. That's very possible. But for Clinton, I think her worldview has always been a very strong belief in the government. I think that extends from domestic to foreign, and I really do think she has shown a proclivity for thinking that we do need a very strong military, a very large overseas presence, because we could always use it for some ends or some means or some interest. And I think for her, pulling that back would, for her, be perceived as a weakness for America. And I think that's a lot of the same mentality, honestly, that we did see under President George Bush, and to some extent Barack Obama. But I think she would be to Obama's right, certainly.
Well, I knew this would be a very hopeful, uplifting, promising discussion of death by fire, death by drowning. What are the news stories that you're working on right now?
Yeah, so we're working on, we've been working on a number of things related to this debate. One is just tracking sort of where the neoconservatives are shaking out, people like the Kagans and Max Boot and so on and so forth, and how they're realigning in this presidential primary. But you're talking about, we don't want to make it too negative a discussion. So I think there is definitely something happening at the grassroots level among younger people in the United States. I think that we've seen a tremendous youth turnout for like a Bernie Sanders, because I think that people under the age of, let's say, 35 do not have a whole lot of taste for what they've seen under the last couple of presidents. And I think part of that is that, think about it. If you were born, if you were a teenager today, and maybe you're high school or junior high, you've never lived in an America that has not been at war in one way or another. You've never lived in an America that didn't think that it needed a gigantic NSA, mass intercepting phone calls, particularly ones made overseas. You never lived in America where there was really a strong economy, where a lot of jobs were being created, where there was a lot of opportunity for people, and you've never lived in America where healthcare just wasn't insanely expensive. I think these younger people view the problems today as so tough and intractable that we need very strong, almost like political revolution, as Bernie Sanders says, or as any number of other people running would say. We need those big, strong systemic changes, more revolutionary style changes. And I think that group of young people is fueling movements. Like we see the Dreamer movement, and we see Fight for 15, and we obviously see, the Palestinian Solidarity movement, which is very strong among young people, much stronger than older generations. And I think that those people are not going to stop, whether it's a President Trump or Cruz or Clinton or Bernie were to pull it out. I don't think any of these young people would decide that, it's time for us to, sit on our hands and accept all this, because they're living in an America, I think, that's fundamentally different than the America that people in older generations lived in. I think the challenges they face are unique, and they have all sorts of energy, and they have technology that wasn't available to previous generations. And I think those things will really shake up the political class in this country at some point. I think Donald Trump channeled a lot of that energy on the right this time among people who are highly dissatisfied. Bernie challenged a lot of people on the left who are highly dissatisfied, but I think it's only going to grow. There's no way that I don't think there's any way that this political energy that's fueling these movements for change is going to dissipate just based on time. I mean, it may to some extent, but I think there's a lot of underlying conditions that will bubble up into different things. We saw that with Occupy Wall Street. We saw that with the Black Lives Matter movement. And we're seeing it with the climate movement all over the world, the future of the earth itself. So I think that these movements are bigger and they're noisier than they were in the past. And I do think that they will impact the political environment at some point or another. And I don't think that somebody even like a President Clinton is entirely prepared to deal with them should they, rise to the level to where that they would actually impact the federal policy, congressional policy, and administration's policy. And I think that they would be forced to adapt as well. I mean, I think these social movements can be that strong. But I think it does take a lot of hard work, like, what you're doing and what we're doing, to create those sorts of changes. But I think people should just realize that those things are out there. They do exist. And that the political class itself is not so strong in this country as it even was 10 years ago. I mean, there's record level of distrust in our institutions, record level of number of people identify as independents, political independence. And I think that, in this election, we definitely saw a couple candidates channel that energy. But if it continues to grow, it may just, the cup might run it over, right? We may see the sort of tipping points that we hadn't seen in the past. And I think a lot of the work that we're doing here at The Intercept and sort of exposing government and corporate elites and exposing politicians and holding them accountable, hopefully, will contribute to those larger social changes.
That was really well said. And if you're young, you need to share this. If you're under 35, if you're over 35 and you know somebody under 35, you need to share this. I'm going to put links to how you could learn more about Zaid, where you could read him on The Intercept. But one thing you got to do is start following him on Twitter, because he's very active. He's really great at helping me get insights into where the news stories that I should be focusing in on. Thank you for being on our show. You've been a really great guest. Thank you.
Thanks.